research, which was on the impact of IMF conditional loans on the long-term economic growth of LICs and LMICs. So I've been told that's a bit of a word salad, so let me break down my title for you here. What's the IMF? The IMF is an international body. It stands for the International Monetary Fund, and its main purpose is to promote global economic growth and stability. And one of the main ways that it does this is by providing financial assistance as well as policy advice. And then what are LICs and LMICs? This is just the abbreviation for lower income countries and lower middle income countries. And these are countries with a GDP per capita of less than $4,465. And then what are conditional loans? So if a country's in a liquidity crisis, they need funding, they can go to the IMF and request funds. But these funds don't just come with maybe an interest rate attached, not even just a high interest rate attached. They come with very stringent conditions that you have to implement in order to receive the loans. And these conditions often focus on fiscal austerity, so this would be cuts in investment spending, any type of public spending, education spending, kind of like transfer payments, like I guess like the equivalent of US Social Security, whatever that would be in these countries. And then they also come with structural reforms as well. So you may hear that the IMF tries to push nations towards a more free market system, or that they try to liberalize countries. These are these structural reforms, as well as monetary and exchange rate policies. So there's an ongoing debate on whether or not these loans, these conditions that these loans impose, actually help countries or not. The IMF hypothesizes or says that these loans are supposed to provide the foundations that countries need to develop, so that they don't just have this cycle of crises after crises and keep needing funding. However, many economists argue that these loans may actually exacerbate downturns because of these cuts in spending and these structural reforms. And so my research topic examines the impact of IMF conditional loans on the long-term economic growth of lower-income countries. So why does this matter? If IMF conditional loan programs do indeed stunt growth, it's not just that the IMF is failing its mission of promoting growth and stability, they're trapping millions in poverty and increasing global inequality. So this has real-world consequences. A quick look at the literature review on this. Research is split. Many economists find a negative correlation between long-term economic growth and these conditions. Some famous economists here would be Bill Barrow, Axel Dreyer, Stanley Fischer, and James Freeland. And then positive correlation, on the other side, many studies find a positive correlation between long-term growth and IMF loans. This would be Patrick Conway, Calista Sadler, Dix Morell. But something that's important to note is that pretty universally, all these studies find a short-term contraction. So they find that in the short term, countries pay a high price for this potential long-term payoff. And this is important to keep in mind as we go forward, because if we find that these loans don't have a long-term payoff, then why are they paying this high price, right? So just keeping that in mind. And then there's gaps in research. So one of the gaps is time frame. Most studies, data ends in the early 2000s. I'm studying countries that enter IMF loans between 2010 and 2023, but I use lagged variables, so the data starts in 2007. And this is important because if you think about the last 15-ish so years, there's been a lot that's happened in the global economy. Think about the 2008 recession as well as COVID, and this has shifted the global economy. So looking at this data in a more updated time frame can help give us a more updated idea of what these loans are causing now. And then also income classification. So most studies combine all developing countries together, whereas my study is looking just at lower income countries and lower middle income countries. And this is important because there could be different effects for a higher income country than a lower income country, just due to the fact that they have different foundations or a different development level. And if we lump them all together, we can obscure that true effect. So I like this quote by Belima and Soglova in 2021. It says, researchers have produced a plethora of evidence that nevertheless does not yield a consensus on the direction of the effect. And this is important because it indicates that this isn't just rehashing already solved issue. There's still no consensus on what these loans actually cause, and so this is contributing to ongoing research. So my research objectives. My hypothesis was that IMF conditional loan programs lead to reduced long-term economic growth in LICs and LMICs. And this was founded in Keynesian theory, Solow model, and structuralist theory, which at a very high level, all these theories posit that if you cut investment spending and just public spending in general, it's going to hinder long-term growth. My methodology, when you're doing this study, there were two issues. One is endogeneity and one is selection bias. And I needed to be able to control for both. Endogeneity is this idea of reverse causality. Is IMF program participation causing the negative outcomes, or is the negative, like the fact that the country is already in crisis, causing these long-term negative outcomes? So I controlled for that using an IV two-stage SLS model, as well as a control function approach, which I'll get into. And very quickly, my instrumental variables were debt service, and then also U.S. Official development assistance per capita. The reason for this is we assumed that debt service. So if you have high levels of debt service, this may impact your need for a program, impact your need for funding, as well as the fact that there have been many studies that show that the IMF is heavily influenced by the U.S. They have a lot of voting power within the IMF, and so if you are politically aligned with the U.S., you're more likely to get funds. So that's why we use U.S. official development assistance per capita. And then I also control for selection bias. So this is the idea that countries who enter IMF programs are systematically different than those that don't. And to control for this, I used a Heckman selection model, and my selection variables were debt, trade balance. The year prior to IMF program participation, I used that growth, GDP growth, as well as political stability. My data, I had 22 treatment countries and 29 control countries for a total of 51 countries in my data set, and then my data range was 2003 to 2023, and my data sources were mainly from the World Bank and the IMF MONA databases. So now I'll look at my models. All my models are two-stage so that I could control for selection bias and endogeneity. Two-stage SLS and CFA control for endogeneity, but they do it in different ways. So a two-stage SLS model, the first stage is a linear regression versus a CFA model or control function approach. The first stage is a probit model. And that's important because this first stage is predicting IMF participation. And so if you have IMF participation is a binary variable. So if you're predicting a binary variable with linear regression, that may not work very well. So that's why we also did the CFA model. And then my second stage is the same, pretty much the same across my models. I use the same control variables, which is investment spending, inflation, trade openness, which I measured by tariff rate, and then political stability and government consumption. With a two-stage model, my two-stage linear model, in the second stage, IMF participation, so this one right here, is replaced with the fitted values from the first stage. But then with the control function approach, the IMF participation stays the same, or IMF variable is just a binary variable of whether or not you entered, but then you add the residuals from the first stage. So they control for endogeneity slightly differently, but they're both controlling for endogeneity. And then with my Heckman model, now realizing that this slide is this is Heckman model. My first stage is a little bit different because I'm controlling for selection bias. So like I mentioned earlier, I use debt, trade balance, the prior GDP growth, as well as political stability. Then my second stage, it's the same as before, except for this right here. This is your inverse Mills ratio, which is from the first stage, and that is how you control for selection bias. Okay, so my results. A quick look at these results, I'll break them down a bit, but you can see that my IV two-stage linear model, this one was not statistically significant. Its effect was completely the opposite direction of the rest of my models, and its confidence interval was huge. The standard errors were very big. That signals something's off with that model. But my CFA model and my Heckman model, both of these have statistically significant results, as well as the fact that the selection bias and endogeneity were confirmed to exist. So, my results. So, likely the reason why this two-stage linear model didn't work was that it was using a linear regression for the first stage, which is a binary, it's modeling a binary outcome. And so because of that, and because of how small my sample size is, if you try and do that, it's going to bias your results. It's not going to work. And you can tell because my standard errors are too large, confidence intervals too large, and they're statistically insignificant results. However, what was interesting from this is that the instruments that I used, they were weak, but they passed the standard validity tests, which meant I could use them in my CFA model. So I did. Now my IV and CFA Heckman models, these are both had statistically significant results, and they both showed the same correlation between growth and IMF program participation. So they showed a statistically significant negative effect on growth, and as well as that presence of endogeneity and selection bias are validated. That's just your residual and your inverse Mills ratio. There is a stronger effect in the CFA model than in the Heckman model. If you look at that, you can see that. That's likely due because in this model we see that selection bias exists, but we're not controlling for it in our CFA model, and so because of that, it's probably overestimating the effect of IMF participation. However, what's important here is that the correlation stays consistent. There's a negative correlation between participation and growth. I also used models 2.3, 2.1, and 3.1. They're highlighted in blue because they're my main models. I used the logged variables here. I used logged government consumption and logged investment spending because the idea is that investment spending and government consumption have diminishing returns. So if you log those variables, it's going to better fit the data. So we did that. So conclusion. Overall, these results suggest that IMF program participation is linked to lower long-term growth for LICs and LMICs. This is even after accounting for selection bias and endogeneity. So this indicates that negative outcomes are not due to simply the country's pre-existing financial crisis, but it may be due to the programs themselves. And so this challenges the conception that IMF loan programs are positive or neutral interventions, and instead suggests that they may actively undermine a country's ability to grow. And this is important because if you look at this map here, all this orange and red, these are lower income countries and lower middle income countries. And that is a significant portion of the global population. And so if these IMF programs are hindering countries' ability to grow, it's hindering a significant portion of the global population's ability to grow as well as their quality of life. So, because these results indicate the current IMF conditional lending programs may not support development, and instead they might perpetuate cycles of stagnation and dependency. And this aligns with structuralist theory and Solo model, which I mentioned earlier, which say that if you have cuts to spending and investment, public spending, things like that, then it's going to hinder your long-term growth. And so because of this, to align with its mission, the IMF may need to reconsider its policies, and perhaps it could shift from narrowly focusing on fiscal austerity to instead incentivizing investment in long-term growth drivers that are seen in the structuralist theory or Solo model, as well as investment into political and social institutions and reforming those, since structuralist theory finds that those are important as well to growth. And then before I end here, there are some limitations to my research as well. So one of the limitations that if I had more time, I would have loved to look into, but this was just, my results just show that there's a negative effect. It doesn't show what conditions have the negative effect. So if you did this again, you could break down the conditions and look at it that way to see what are the conditions that the IMF is imposing that has these effects, because it may not be structural reforms, it might be fiscal austerity, it may not be fiscal austerity, it may be structural reforms. And then also just regionally, so I took all lower income countries and all lower middle income countries, but I didn't break them out by region. So maybe there's different impacts regionally. If you looked at like MENA countries or BRICS countries or something like that. So that's like limitations as well as what we could do in the future. And then to end on a hopeful note, while the IMF has the power to hinder growth, as we've seen, it also has the power to propel it. So by reforming its loan policies, it can better support countries in crisis and further their development, and can ultimately contribute to reduction in global inequality and poverty. Thank you, and before I end, I do want to thank Professor Craig and Professor White. You guys have been super helpful with this. Professor Craig, I met with him a bunch of times, and I think I gave him a headache when we were trying to figure out these models, as well as Professor White. So I've really appreciated your guys' support. But yeah, thank you.